To this Festival of Ideas event, and we're grateful that our usual audience is also joined by people from the Local Enterprise Partnership for their conference. You're very welcome, and we hope you'll enjoy and contribute to the debate that we're going to have today. The Festival of Economics takes place every year in Bristol. It's the inspiration is Diane Coyle. Delighted to have her with us today, and she's programmed the festival. This special lunchtime session is looking at the world economy after the crash, and we're delighted to have two brilliant speakers and writers with us. On my right, far right, Daniel Franklin, who is the executive editor of The Economist since 2006, business affairs editor since 2010, and writes and edits the annual The World in whatever year it is, 2014, and is also the author of Megachange, the big trends that are affecting the world to 2050. And joining him is Faisal Islam, who's economic editor of Channel 4 News, used to write for The Observer and The Guardian and The New Statesman, and he's the author most recently of The Default Line, the inside story of people, banks and entire nations on the edge. So they're going to have a discussion between them, and then we're going to open it up for questions. But would you join with me in welcoming to Bristol Daniel Franklin and Faisal Islam?
Thank you very much. Well, in entering this building, there was a queue outside, and I was told that it was Toddler Takeover Day. And I thought, well, it's great. Look what's happening to economics. It's the future. But I'm not quite sure that's what I see in the audience here. But what I thought Faisal and I could do is discuss, first of all, some of the themes that he's brought out in his book, The Default Line. And then we'll move on to some of the issues he poses in that book at the end. I think those questions that you pose at the end are really interesting. And we might touch on briefly on some of the predictions that are in The World in 2014 that's just published by The Economist this week. And then we'll throw it open and have a discussion about whatever you want to discuss. So let's start with that. The book, for those of you who haven't seen it, is a fantastic tour around the world of this extraordinary period of economic life that we've been through, crisis after crisis. And Faisal sort of takes you ringside to all the places where these dramas have been unfolding. And in fact, he begins each chapter with a cast list of the drama. I thought we might just sort of give a flavour of it. You begin, for example, with literally plane loads of money arriving in Athens because Greece is in crisis. And tell us a little bit about that scene and how close actually things were to complete disaster there.
So this I discovered from a Troika official who retired. The Troika is the EU, IMF, European Central Bank, the overlords of the countries that are in crisis and needed bailouts. And essentially, when the amount of money in circulation in an economy, in a developed economy, is typically, in banknote form, it's typically about 3 or 4%. It's 3% here in Britain. People expect that to go down as money becomes more electronic. In Greece, it was a little bit higher. People like to keep cash generally, 6 or 7%. In June 2011 and June 2012, that number went up to 25% of GDP without pictures of panic. That in itself, I think, was an amazing miracle. That the demand for cash, the lack of faith in the banking institutions and in the government of the Greek state was so strong that people literally withdrew the cash and stored it. I think about a third of it was stored, a third of it went abroad, a third of it went into property, and a third of it was, the Central Bank of Greece, was stored under people's beds. I think there was a famous case of a €500 note bundle being eaten by some rats. So that wouldn't be very funny if that was your bundle of €500 notes. So it's obvious in a way. A country like Greece, with its islands and its geography, how on earth do you spread these notes? How do you get them physically in to the island? Now, if you're in a nation state with your own central bank, it's really easy. You print them Bob's your uncle. You get the notes out there.
And the problem in
Everything's
Greece
fine.
was, as you described, that they could print the €10. Was it the €10 notes? But
Yeah.
they could print. They had their printing presses could do the €10 note, but mysteriously the €500 note was only printed in the kind of
Germans, Austrians, and
world.
Luxembourg.
Funny that,
So they
but
only they were given the plates for the 500.
So you could either have gazillions of coins, which the Greeks could mint, or
€10 notes. So essentially, to
Building
meet that demand, to, if you like, turn electronic deposits in Greece's banks into actual currency, it was required that these notes came into the island, came into Greece itself. Now, the way it works in Greece, now in the British crisis, the Bank of England sent out spotters to see incipient queues. This was after learning the lesson of Northern Rock, which caught them by surprise. For Bradford and Bingley, they sent out spotters to 30 quite populated Bradford and Bingley branches, and they were reporting on them, and more importantly, reporting on the presence of any stray TV camera, because that's when you can have a run. I mean, it's a bit like, Schrodinger's cat? As long as the run is not observed by anybody else, it's not a run. I think I've invented a new theory here. I don't know what you'd call it. And likewise, the bank run. And so,
Faisal's fact, I think.
and so in Greece, these things. That's because in Britain you can go into a bank and take out loads of money. In Greece, it's sort of accepted that when you go and take out all your savings, that it won't be delivered till the next day. So the Greek government had a very good sort of a very good kind of view over where cash was being required. And then that was transmitted to the central bank. And then that went through to the euro system. So Greece's central bank is not in Athens. Greece's central bank is in Frankfurt. So the cash had to be flown in, essentially. Now, in some ways, and this is what the central bank has said, this is a very typical, normal, logistical operation. Don't get too excited about it. But in other ways, it's pretty dramatic because, there you go. There you have an actual physical manifestation of what it's like not to have monetary sovereignty. Because
people didn't know at the time, did they? This sort of
well, they knew that everybody was
sort of went on.
Yes, because there was normal.
There
it was
weren't television
logistical.
cameras.
Yeah, exactly.
Seeing the flights come in, the cash being
now.
unloaded.
To be clear, I've established that all this happened, and the sorts of and you can deduce the amounts from the central bank of Greece's balance sheet. But you have to adjust it. It's not particularly clear, this stuff. The central bank of the Eurozone likes to give off the impression that basically it doesn't really matter how many banknotes are in one part of our zone. It's a bit like me saying how many £10 notes are there in Bristol. It's irrelevant. It just floats around. But it doesn't really work like that. So that was rather dramatic. And lo and behold, armed with this information, which I found out about a year ago, and then I sort of tried to stand up journalistically. I then go to Cyprus, and I think, for Channel 4 News in March, and I thought, I wonder if this is happening now. I bet you it is. And we went searching for the planes, and we found the planes. And then I was on Twitter, and this is great new journalism. I was on Twitter, I was like, and people told me you can track the planes using, probably some guys here do this for fun, you can track the planes if you get the tail fin number, and you can see everywhere it's flown. And so I did that, and you could see it flown from, I can't remember which area, Cologne, yeah. So fairly close to Frankfurt, and it was a Maersk Star airline cargo flight, and it had gone to Athens, and then it had come to Cyprus. So you could check out these flights, and then this is the really interesting thing, and it shows you how attitudes change. The ECB had denied these planes existed or played them down in the case of Athens in 2011 and 2012. When it came to Cyprus, they briefed the German press that this was happening. And why did they do that? Because in the case of Greece 2 years ago, the existence of this type of logistical operation would have scared people. In the case of Cyprus, where you already had bank runs, they wanted to reassure people. So they let it be known. And I'm sitting in a hotel in Cyprus, and there are helicopters buzzing. We think there's basically a coup, or the Turks have invaded, or something like that. And it's literally the planes landed, and the helicopters are accompanying 4 giant juggernauts full of cash to the central bank of Nicosia, and then it fans out using G4S vans, God bless them, to the whole of Cyprus. But still, I do wonder. I then went and checked, because you can also, if you get a euro note, you can check the origin there's a letter on each euro note. You can check the origin. And I went around testing cash machines to see where the notes came from, which got very costly for my bank balance. But and it didn't seem to tally up. So I just scratched my head and I throw this out to you. I do wonder whether it was all a giant fake and whether there was no cash. And in fact, this was all a giant behavioural. I don't put that in the book. I throw that out.
Huge conspiracy theory.
No, it's not a conspiracy. It's quite smart, actually. It's quite smart. You're like, you answer plane, we go mad. All your cash is here, and then what happens? Nobody withdraws the cash because they think it's there.
So it's Greece and Cyprus, extraordinary events, and really not very long ago. One more stop, and then we'll move on to the issues for the future. But you're in Reykjavik, and I think it was the governor of the Bank of Iceland is assuring you that these big 3 Icelandic banks are safe as houses, absolutely fine. How does that work?
So after Northern Rock, a number of people were pointing out that Iceland was sketchy, and looking into that, it looked pretty sketchy. But this happened at the exact... And they couldn't raise money from ordinary sophisticated investors. But lo and behold, the FSA, the regulator in Britain, in its wisdom, had waved through the idea these banks, not being able to raise money from sophisticated markets, could instead raise money via internet savings accounts from ordinary kind of families in Britain and Holland, in Britain and in the European case, in Holland. So you can't get it off the hedge funds and you can't get it off the investment banks. Why not get it from ordinary families instead in Britain? Brilliant stuff. And they never expected it to be quite so successful. They hadn't really worked out how finance has changed, how it isn't very sticky, there's no loyalty. People look at, and the Icelandic central banks, Icelandic banks brilliantly gamed the best buy tables that you see in the Sunday papers and on the internet, gave the best interest rate. People had forgotten that with top interest rates come risk. And they sucked in £6 billion of savings in a matter of weeks, with the connivance of the British press, frankly, which sort of described these banks as great Viking invaders here to save us from evil British banks that don't want to pay us our returns. This was absolutely crazed and insane. So I think, well, I'll go to the central bank governor and ask him if this money. It was something like 80% of the GDP of Iceland if they had to pay up. Even though they had no debt, it would have been a debt that they couldn't really afford, and they didn't have enough pounds to pay us back. And there's nothing quite like sitting opposite a central bank governor, looking into their eyes, and saying, "Do you have this cash? Where's the cash? If we need it back, have you got it?" And he said, "Oh yes, it's perfectly safe. Our banks are perfectly safe." And at that point, any central bank governor that needs to say that, even if he's not lying, which he was. The fact that
consciously he was lying, you believe?
Oh, yes, he was, because it's been proved subsequently that before my piece went out, he'd already having meetings with the Bank of England.
The real question is why he agreed to the interview.
I've absolutely no idea. Well, he agreed to the interview because we were going to run the story anyway, so he thought he was going to reassure. And let me give you one other little tiny story about this strange nexus between being a journalist talking about panics. It's a really difficult area, right? Especially with TV. And I am exactly 5 years ago, I faced my scariest moment as a journalist, which wasn't in oil fields of northern Iraq or in Athens squares with tear gas. It was actually on the roof of the ITN building on the day the bailout was not quite finished, but being done. So it was October the 9th, I think it was, 2008. And RBS, we knew tens of millions was being withdrawn from RBS. Rather comically, somebody withdrew 50 million from RBS in the city and put it in NatWest, which is exactly the same. Which is exactly the same bank, and that guy works in the city, so it's all you need to know about what bankers know. So, so park that for a second. So, and I say, so Snow says, "Okay, we've got to talk about this." Okay, and I said, "Okay, you can ask me whatever you want. Just don't ask me the following question: should we take all our money out of RBS?" Because, I mean, we shouldn't really go there with that. So we just, if you're going to ask something like that, ask it a bit more subtly. So I get up on the roof, I'm getting ready, John's there, and he sort of forgets, and he just goes, "Faisal, should we take all our money out of RBS?" and you're like, my life flashed before me. What's the right answer to that question? Answer no. Is it sense, but then again, if everyone else is doing it, you probably should do it. I didn't say that, obviously. I should try and reassure people. But what if, in trying to reassure people, they actually get scared? Why am I having to reassure people? Where's Mervyn King? Where's Alistair Darling? Where's the boss of this bank? He's getting paid hundreds of thousands. And so you face quite a difficult set of incentives, even as a journalist, in trying to even the basic act of describing what was going on. And the Iceland story was very delicate because I didn't want to incite a run, so we waited for 4 months. And in the end, although I did get told that a number of councils acted on the story that we put out, which came out 6 months before the crash happened, I don't know if that's good or bad. Is it? I mean, maybe we contributed to the demise. But then equally, the Icelandic banks knew that if they could scare journalists into saying you're spreading panic, nobody would write that it was totally insane that these guys were taking money. So, there are journalistic issues around these financial panics that still haven't quite been solved.
I think that's something we could perhaps return to in the debate. Let's move on to two areas. We'll come on perhaps in a minute to your some of the questions you posed at the end of the book. I wanted to just say a word about where we are now in the state of the economy and give you a bit of a sense of the forecast, at least as emerges from this latest publication, latest set of predictions from The Economist in the world in 2014. Interested whether you broadly agree with this or not. The broad picture that we're painting is that for the West, for the rich world, it's not great, but it's better. Primarily because America is better. America has got this shale gas boom going on. Its housing market has recovered. It's not got the same drags on the economy that it had before. Even Europe is growing a bit, probably grow by 1% or so next year. UK doing quite a bit better, seems to have a bit of momentum going. Japan has obviously got the stimulus of Abenomics. So if you take all those things together and you look also at the emerging world, which the emerging world is doing much better than it used to be, growing much faster than the West, but it's slowed down compared with how it was in recent years. The balance is swimming a little bit back towards the West. That's the broad picture. And there's going to be more interest, more good news coming from the Western world, perhaps, in the coming year than from the emerging markets, where countries like India, Brazil have hit some problems. So I suppose that's the broad picture, by no means out of the woods, and this overlaying all this tremendous policy problem that the West has given itself of how do you start to unwind the massive stimulus of quantitative easing? So Janet Yellen presumably coming into to the Fed, central bankers facing an extraordinarily challenging year, and one in which they've exhausted their traditional tools of yanking interest rates up and down a bit. So they've got this unconventional set of tools that they're toying with: forward guidance, quantitative easing, and so on. And they don't quite know the best way of using them. So they face a very tough year. That's a sort of, in essence, the picture that we're painting. Does that strike you as in line with what you're seeing?
So, yeah, I mean, clearly things now we're not in the bottom state, sixth circle of hell as we have been. We're probably in, third or fourth, something like that. But I think my perspective would be that in America, where you're starting to see the fortuitous discovery of shale helping transform the US economy, the reshoring of manufacturing, all those things are quite positive developments, coupled with the fact that its housing market kind of cleared and its banks have written off these debts. So you've seen the kind of the cycle
much more vigorous adjustment in America, basically.
Yeah, and house prices fell. The fear would be that in Britain, yes, things are looking good for the next year or two, but was that because rather than unwind QE, we just wound up the stimulus even more? I mean, the sad answer is, and so that in terms of the current recovery that we're seeing, there's no doubt about it. Things are looking up in the UK economy. Every single monetary policy and policy kind of thruster is on full thrust. You have the Bank of England not just with low interest rates for some time to come. You have them funding bank lending that was supposedly for small businesses, which is more risky and takes time to get into the economy, to filter into the economy, but ends up helping the economy more sustainably. Lo and behold, most of it's gone into mortgages. On top of that, you have the Bank of England freeing up funding and liquidity requirements for banks as well. And then on top of that, you have the government subsidising mortgages as well. At a time when the housing market dipped in Britain, and there's a huge differential between London and the rest of the country. But I don't think people would say it cleared. It didn't reflect an economy where median wages have fallen, where there's been a squeeze for 5 years. I mean, you think about all the models, all the economic models of what goes into house prices. I mean, as far as I can see, they broke in 2003. Okay, so you'd think that they'd start to apply again, but they haven't started to apply again. They have absolutely no connection at all to, if you like, domestic financial conditions. So you're now getting this situation where, what sort of recovery is this? It's a very legitimate question, and I would say, obviously, at the minimum, the jury's out. But when you see the housing recovery in London, obviously disproportionately impacting the numbers nationally, but when you dig down,
it's not really a recovery in London. I'm not sure it ever really dipped.
Well,
in London,
it depends how. Well, yes, that's a very good point. But then when you see, and then this sort of throws towards your more global point, and I did mention this in the book, when you see that of, I think it's something like 50,000 homes being built in London, thousands, the property developers cannot get loans from banks. That channel does not work still. The banks will not lend to these types of developments. So private equity and sovereign wealth funds have come into property to fund property. They don't have the same ability as banks to conjure money and to write it off. So what have they done? They need these flats to be sold in advance, even as the site is still a hand car wash in Bow. And that is literally true. So what do? They fly to Kuala Lumpur. I mean, you couldn't even make this up, right? They fly, and we filmed this, and I fell off my chair when I saw the footage come back. They fly to Kuala Lumpur and Hong Kong, and they sell these flats, half of the developments, a third of the developments, in advance to these guys. And you're going to think, oh, the mega-rich. It's not the mega-rich. It's dentists and doctors. It's fairly ordinary middle-class people in savings-abundant East Asia are so lacking in confidence of their own banking system and what the governments in their countries will give to them when they're old or for their children, and yet, conversely, so welcome to pop their money into London, into British property, that is driving the property cycle in Britain. I have some concerns about that.
Unless you want to go and see a dentist in one of these countries, let's just pick up one or two of the things at the end of your book and then throw it open, because I think you raise some issues which it really is interesting to chew on. One of them is something we've been writing about quite a bit recently in The Economist, which is this fact that the Labour's share of the economy, and this is not just Britain, this is actually happening around the world. Labour's share is decreasing over time, and capital's share is growing. So that partly explains why you can have people in employment, people, even economies growing, but people feeling worse off, people still feeling squeezed, because less of this is going to, less of the pie, if you like, a smaller slice is going to wages than to capital. And you have, one of your ideas that you throw out is that one part of the solution to this might be to tax wealth more than, or put more wealth taxes on compared with taxes on labour.
So I think that there's a generational thing here. It's not massively, this would not be the sort of policy that would emerge from a focus group or from conventional political thinking. But conventional political thinking gave us a housing boom that trebled real house prices, whilst everyone was supposed to think that that was a grand party that we were all enjoying, whereas it was just a transfer from one part of society to another. So on top of that housing boom, bubble, whatever you want to call it, you then have quantitative easing, which is essentially monetary policy or policy to stimulate the economy by increasing asset prices even further or maintaining those asset prices at those high levels. So you have policies over the past 10 to 15 years, certainly in Britain, other parts of the Western economies, that have enabled the wealthy to become more wealthy. Much of that earned wealth is entirely, I'm not into seizing it or anything like that, but I'm just saying it's not. When you see the tax system over the past 50 years, and Martin Wheel, who's on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, done some extremely interesting research into this, how the tax system shifted away from taxes on land and wealth towards taxes on people. I think you need to rate, that's the first point. And then when you think about the costs, the fiscal costs that we're going to see in Britain and in the rest of the West over the next 50 years, will largely be about an ageing society. To me, it seems to make sense that the balance of taxation would shift away from people working towards that accumulated wealth. That
Good luck politically. That's the trouble.
Good luck politically, but exactly. Yeah, taxes on property are generally quite sensible things economically for an exchequer. Yet the IFS point out, the property tax system in Britain is a mess. It's sort of a bit council tax. It's a bit inheritance tax. It's a bit stamp duty. There's undoubtedly, and they call for a kind of a more sensible reform of it, which I think is a very well-founded criticism. But I think the point would be, the policy direction at the moment is the parties are competing on ever smaller council tax. I mean, council tax is the only effective property tax that we have each year, and it's still based on 1990 values. So I think that a brave reforming political leadership would look at the balance of taxation, recognising that in order for an economy to sustain, you have to maintain incentives to work rather than accumulate wealth.
Right.
But our politicians aren't sensible, so it's not going to happen.
Well, let's take one other issue and then we'll open it up. Well, the other issue, and this really is, I think, more of a narrowly British one rather than what we were just talking about is actually a global phenomenon. Yeah. And that is the housing question. We were just talking about housing before. What do you do about this? And one obvious thing to do would be to just have a massive house building to address the question of supply. Clearly, demand is going to increase. The population is rising quite fast in this country. Tackle the supply question by supply problem by a much bigger program of home building. Part of the answer to that is money, but it's also, this is something you stress, planning, isn't it? Our planning system tends to get this thing stuck, isn't that right?
I think I'd really like to see the people running the country just step back a bit and think about where the country is going structurally. And you sort of, there's a great vision that a geographer, I forget who it is, takes pictures of Britain at night over the decades. And what you see is the lights going off in the periphery of the United Kingdom, all round, whether it's from the West Country all the way around to the north and to Scotland. And it's literally, you can see the black hole effect of London, and it's just kind of everything sucking into London, and London becoming this kind of almost kind of luminous quality. And this is what happens. And you've got to wonder, people say that's just the free market at work. I don't think it is the free market at work. We have issues around labour mobility. Our great obsession with housing means that people don't move house, which means that they don't respond to incentives. Companies, for example, instead of employing graduates on 40,000, 30,000 out of university, could create the jobs out of university in Bristol or Manchester or Leeds and employ guys on 25,000, and they'd have a much better standard of living, and the companies would make more money. Yet that dynamic doesn't kick in Britain, part of that will be planning. Part of it will be our obsession with people owning that house. Part of that will be our awful transport infrastructure. But we don't run the country in a particularly balanced way. And, okay, there's a lot of annoying stuff where people go, look at Germany, aren't they great? They've got everything. They have nice transport, greenhouses. They have a good football team. It travels to their matches on the tube. But And I think that offers quite an interesting set of questions for Britain's political settlement,
And
a
very big rental sector in their
yes,
housing market.
yes.
But
What does the rental
bubble.
sector mean? So the graph is Britain's real house prices trebled at a time when German house prices fell. What was the end result of that? It means that Germans build houses that need to be demanded and liked. So they get better houses that have space, that are innovative, that are brilliant for the environment, they have a technological passive house which has 90% less energy consumption. You solve your climate change issue if you have houses like that. We don't do that in Britain. Because why? Because any house that gets built gets bought by someone desperate for a house, because hardly any houses get built. So I just think people taking a step back and looking at the dysfunction of where things are going and the fact that their children can't get houses, the older people, totally understandably, are buying up homes because they can't get pensions. There's a whole set that we live in a complex system that it is all connected. And what I'm trying to do with the book is sort of shine a light on that, and also shine a light, frankly, on the complete poverty of solutions. I'm not saying I've got massive solutions to this. Beware of anybody with a grand narrative that claims all the answers. But it depresses me how little, when I meet our elected representatives, they think about this stuff. And
maybe there are some solutions in this room. So let's. I know there are lots of people here who've been thinking about local planning issues.
There was one point, and I want to throw it back at you, actually, which is I do wonder whether this means, if you look at what's winning in the world, in the globalised world, the sorts of things that I've spotted over the past 5 or 10 years of traversing the world is that governments that are winning are just being a bit more strategic and planning and thinking. And you must see this in East Asia. And I wonder if it asks questions of our settlement in Britain that the market has won, and the end result of whatever happens, if it's the result of a pure market process, must be right because it's economic efficiency. And my question is that process is often it's hardly ever the free market. It's always, there's some interference that you can't see. And so I just wonder if a sensible government thinks about solutions. It thinks about things like, how do we house people in the future? And it thinks about things like, okay, we have an issue. The type of jobs that are being created in a service sector economy are not great for unskilled young men, right? What are we going to do with a surfeit of unskilled young men over the next 10 to 20 years? Is this going to become a massive social and political problem for the country that we need to plan and deal with? Or do we just sort of say, well, the market will sort it out, maybe they'll leave, they'll go somewhere else, So, we don't like to plan, so I wonder if something needs to change in the political philosophy of the way both main parties
our political systems are struggling. It reminds me of I think it was more than a joke. I think it was a wistful comment that was made in the run-up to the economic crisis by a European politician who said, we know what we have to do, we just don't know how to get elected after we've done it. And that is part of the problem. A lot of these solutions are actually deeply unpopular. In effect, we all in this room are part of the problem, because you talk about intergenerational stuff. I don't think that voters generally vote against their own narrow self-interest, and that's a problem for politicians who say, well, we've got to help young people. Everybody can agree with that in theory, but in practice they don't necessarily want to see their money transferred to a future generation. So I think it's genuinely difficult stuff, and that's why it's interesting. Let's open it up and see, yes, at the back. I think we have a couple of roving mics.
Thank you. I totally agree that we're in a time where
Could you say who you are, just so that
sorry. I'm Daniel Oliver. I'm a social entrepreneur and director of Bristol and Bath Social Enterprise Network. So I completely agree that we're in a time when we need solutions. There's been a lot of talk today, this morning, and generally about the role of the city region or metropolitan economy, greater autonomy and also greater rewards for that. My question to you is, what are some of the socio-economic problems which city region economies are well placed to solve? What solutions have you seen out there, and what do you feel is being overlooked by our current approach to economic development?
So I think
a small set of
questions.
It's
actually quite. You need massive policy autonomy, because then you get experimentation. It's a sort of slightly market solution, but it's a market solution in providing powers at a more local state level. And I think we're not talking. This government's approach is to give it to all these shire councils and all that sort of stuff. okay, I mean, do all that stuff if you want to, but I mean, the main drivers of the economy, and you see this in your book in the 2050s, are going to be big cities. They are they're going to drive the future fate of our nations forward. And I think you would want to see different approaches emerge in the Bristol city region versus Manchester. I want to see a city experiment with saying all new housing has to be this fancy new standard where you can only have 10% of current emissions. There are some cool cities, possibly Bristol's one of them, maybe Brighton's the only other one, where that would get through the electorate. And lo and behold, in 5 or 10 years' time, all the new housing stock, people would be inviting TV crews in and say, look, I pay 10% of my neighbour's energy bill, and it's great. So I think that's on the energy front. On the planning front as well. I think you need massive sort of city region autonomy to experiment with things like taxes. Britain is a very interesting place in that we happen to host, and I think it's generally speaking a good thing, but it's not always good, the world's capital city. And that has an impact on the rest of the country that is recognised very little by Westminster, that there's a different set of solutions that would make sense for the rest of Britain as opposed to the narrow metropolitan London view. I have a word for this, which is Londamentalism. I think you need policy innovations at a local level. These could stretch from planning to housing policy. I would want to see cities take... why on earth would some very well-read PPE Oxford graduate in Westminster at a think tank connected to their uncle's favourite MP know more than some guy in Bristol about the problems in Clifton? Is Clifton a rough area? No, it's a really, really rich area, isn't it? Clifton's not rough. See, I don't know. Which is in the tough area of Bristol. I'm from Manchester. Why on earth? I'll start that again. Why on earth would someone like that know anything about how to deal with Moss Side in Manchester? You've got to give those powers locally. It's not just that, though. So that sounds a bit statist. I think you should look at corporation taxes and local taxes and maybe minimum wages. People won't like that in the trades unions, the idea that you'd set a different minimum wage. But, I mean, it's kind of self-evident, really, that the sustainable level of living is different in London than it is in Bristol or Manchester. You have this, of course, in federal Germany. You have it particularly in the United States, where you have 50 state laboratories plus city laboratories, and you have a massive amount of policy experimentation. Things that really work then can get picked up and used elsewhere. We probably don't have enough of that in our very centralised nation. Let's take some more questions. Yes, over.
Thank you. Nigel Cossey from the Southwest TUC. You raised the question about the wages squeeze.
Here we go.
And you talked about 5 years.
No, you see, Southwest is different, I know. Southwest has got very high cost of living, but I'll just get that in now.
But the wage squeeze has really been going on for about 30 years, the share going to wages. Right. And that graph mirrors, not just in Britain, but across certainly America, the decline of collective bargaining. We do have a labour market that's casualised, that's fragmented, that's disempowered. To what extent do we need to return to empowering working people in order to be able to address the balance of power in the workplace to push wages back up?
Try to have a first go at that and then Faisal can... I mean, I think actually, if you look at the sort of economic literature on this, the answer is rather nuanced and in a sense more interesting. That yes, I think that's probably part of what's been happening, but two other forces are one related and they're perhaps both related, seem to have a very big impact on this. One is technology. So labour is being substituted by technology in all sorts of areas. And the other is globalization. So, it's the competition, the ability to shift your labour from one place to another, which obviously is partly linked to bargaining power of local labour forces. But it's not just the unionisation. It's not just an organisation. There are very, very deep forces at work here, which, as you rightly point out, aren't just recent and aren't just affecting this country, they're affecting all sorts of countries. So I think to get at the answer, we're not going to reverse technology. We're probably not going to reverse, I wouldn't want to reverse globalization. So I think we have to look for a whole range of policies that, in effect, give Labour a bigger share in the capital side. And at the moment, that capital side is very skewed to, the people at the very top. And that's overlaid on this problem of a bigger slice going to a smaller slice going to Labour, and of that share that's going to Labour, a disproportionate share is going to the people at the very top, sort of 1% issue.
I think let's be pretty clear. There was something that Mervyn King said at a press conference about a year ago, and I couldn't believe he actually said it. He said something like, "We should be proud of the fact that the wage." He said it in very technical language, but I'll say what he said and then I'll say what it actually meant. We should be proud of the fact that the wage inflation spiral did not spark despite our 25% devaluation. And everyone just said, oh, okay. What that means in translation is we should be proud that Britons basically don't have the bargaining power to get their wages to go up with the fact that prices have gone up because we've had a fairly substantial devaluation of the pound. Should we be proud? I don't know if we should be proud. It sounds like an amazingly controversial statement to me, but, we just say, oh, yeah, proud, well done. And then if you look at, in the Eurozone as well, the ECB template, or if you like, the Berlin template for solving the Eurozone crisis is to transport the German labour market reforms all around Europe, which, again, this is kind of low wages are the answer. And I don't understand how that works democratically, but what Mervyn King's statement said was actually no one seems to have kicked up a fuss. It doesn't really matter. So capital will get away with it for as long as it can. I think my fear is that you're going to get a big backlash, social backlash against this. And one of the reasons why the Labour's share has gone down is because the market has become globalised. So you have a single global market, and Labour has to obviously compete abroad. So what's going to happen? The natural response to that is that the process of globalisation goes into reverse, and trade tensions should spark. Frankly, they should have sparked already. I find it amazing that we haven't had a huge backlash against the globalisation of trade. Yes, trade talks are paused and have fragmented into talks around creating an EU-US free trade area and other things, regionalisation rather than globalisation. But I think that this could flip quite quickly, and people will say, and I'm sure the Economist would not think that this was a good thing, but if solutions aren't found for raising people's living standards, and maybe it comes on the other side of the equation, maybe the challenge for politics is to bring the costs down as well as getting the wages stable and up. And that means things like the cost of housing. We've had a massive debate about the cost of living, and nobody talks about housing.
It's bizarre that house prices going up is for a lot of the population is supposedly a good thing, which I never quite understand.
Yes.
But just to explain, The Economist was founded in 1843 to campaign for free trade on against protectionist corn laws, and so we've been campaigning ever since. So we won't change our spots on that. I think it's interesting to think of the alternative, though, to your question, that if countries where you do have quite strong unions, if you take France, for example, which has very powerful relatively powerful unions, national wage settlements, which can mobilise on the streets quite well. And what you can have in that situation is much higher unemployment. You can have those who are protected doing relatively okay, but you have a lot more people out of work. So it's not an easy answer. And even in countries, what's interesting, even countries where you would think there was a strong egalitarian ethic, such as Nordic countries like Sweden, exactly the same trends have happened, in fact, quite sharply. So I think it's one for where you have to look for very smart policy solutions that give Labour a bigger share. Just
the last thing I'd say on trade unions is I do think maybe in America the culture war was between kind of religious conservatives and hipster baby boom liberals. In Britain, I was born in 1977, and when I was a kid, I thought the Prime Minister had to be a woman. And but that Thatcher Union kind of argument, that culture war, has conditioned politics in Britain, and I think made it quite immature. You know, the unions, it's like any time anything happens with a union, the papers will say it's beer and sandwiches, it's special deals, it's all this and that and the other. You know, if you speak to cabinet ministers privately, saying something like the car industry, they will be fawning about how brilliant the unions have been in keeping car factories, foreign-owned car factories in Britain. You don't hear that story. It doesn't fit the narrative. And it reflects, again, sorry about this, kind of a more, a move towards a more kind of German-style relationship. In the car industry, at least. We haven't seen it in the refineries industry, shall we say, but let's stick with the car industry. A more German-style relationship where, for example, when Angela Merkel faced German trade collapsing on the back of Lehman Brothers collapse, she got all the union leaders and all the business leaders into a hotel for 2 days. Now, can you imagine that would have even been politically possible in Britain without people shouting about, oh, how can you possibly meet with Labour, with the representatives of Labour? That's awful. It just makes sense sometimes to have these conversations. And lo and behold, there was an engineered German compromise between lefty policies of support, offering state subsidies, and right-wing policies of accepting lower hours. And Germany succeeded with the fastest V-shaped recovery of any G7 nation possibly for decades. So I think that there's sensible areas for compromise. And then this very sort of, our political process is so kind of angry and like living in the past. I don't really get it. I mean, I was born in 77, so maybe it's just different for me. I don't really get it. I think there's sensible areas where people have shared interests and these should be reflected. But when I see people who are highly politicised and go into the political parties, they seem to sort of see everything through this lens of you're either a Scargillite or a kind of IEA, Adam Smith Institute, Thatcherite. And it's obviously bizarre and absurd.
Other questions? Gentleman at the front here. Sorry, I can't. There are probably lots of hands going up, but I'm not seeing very well because of the lights. Okay.
It seems to me that...
Did you say who you are? Sorry.
Oh, it's on. It's on, is it? My name is Deepak Kimji. I'm from the International School of Geneva. I've been living out there for 15 years now, and just recently became Swiss, for obvious reasons. It seems to me that the social contract is broken between the government and the people here.
You mean Britain?
In Britain,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Not in Switzerland?
No. Switzerland, we have 7 dwarfs running the system, which is you won't know who's who either. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is successive governments keep breaking these social contracts. You've taken the Anglo-Saxon model of deregulation and just opening, selling off, privatizing anything you can find. Even North Sea oil. The gains from North Sea oil were just given as tax cuts. I think there's a much better model. The model perhaps of Norway. And Norway took the approach of saying, look, the gains from North Sea oil belong to the people. Not belong to the people of now, but also the future. So they built a sovereign wealth fund. And something like $15,000 a year for every man, woman, child is the return to that sovereign wealth fund, which goes straight back into infrastructure, whether it's healthcare, education, and that keeps the quality of the labor up. So Norway's approach is, is to invest in its people. And in here, we just seem to be bribing the people to keep voting for X, Y, and Z party. Yeah.
Well, I think you're right about the sovereign wealth fund in Norway. It's often seen as a sort of model for other countries that have sovereign wealth funds in the way that it's run and its governance system and so on, and its sense of operating for future generations. But we don't have that luxury anymore. Unfortunately, our oil is not gone, but it's well past its peak.
And that which is left will be claimed by Alex Salmond.
We'll see.
But yes, the idea of actually I do have there's a phrase I do say as a quip, who lost Britain's sovereign wealth fund? Where did the oil money go? But that type of thinking requires a fundamental faith, or actually just some faith in the role of the state. And although I'm quite, I'm an economics. I've been studying economics in one form or another for 15 years, and I sort of believe in market allocation principles in general. But there's no faith. Maybe we just don't. It's just maybe not very British. We just don't believe. I mean, the idea of some bureaucrat controlling all the oil money or the proceeds of all the oil tax over 30 years. I can see it as a Norwegian. I can see a Norwegian agreeing that a fellow Norwegian, and by the way, I've met the guy that runs the Norwegian oil fund, and he lives in a normal house. He lived in a normal house with a relatively normal car. And when the value of the fund went down a bit about a couple of years ago because of some investments, he was on the train in to Oslo to his offices, and he was being harangued on the train about how he'd lost all of his fellow citizens' money. This is amazing stuff. Do we genuinely think, if we had a sovereign wealth fund in Britain, that the guy wouldn't be paid like $7 million and be kind of getting a private jet into work? You get, and it's actually one of the conclusions I came to in writing this book, which gave me a bit of a chance to think about things, was that. You kind of, yes, we can blame things on other people, but sometimes the results that you get are a kind of expression of the collective wisdom or lack of wisdom of a society. And things like the housing market, I can blame that on a guy at HBOS and a guy at Northern Rock and a bad regulator and a stupid Treasury minister, and it's really good fun to shout at them on Channel 4 News. But at the end of the day, we ran property documentaries that kind of lionised property on our channel. We sometimes use the idea that house prices going up is a good thing rather than a bad thing. People generally voted for the government that gave them a doubling in house prices. These things won't change unless people think and use examples like Norway to say there are other options. And that was one of the most eye-opening things in writing the book, was to actually see other countries get things right or have solutions to problems that we have. We have first recognise that we have these problems, and second recognise that you can deal with them, but it requires a slightly different relationship. It probably requires a slightly different relationship with the state, not like a Dirigi's French model, but just like thinking. I mean, I think Mariana Mazzucato has written a very interesting book about the state, the entrepreneurial state, and just thinking, don't be. But it doesn't fit very nicely with the Economist agenda, does it? How does the Economist deal with?
I think there's a lot to be done with this to make the state. It has to be made a lot more efficient. The state is one area where we. Well, that's. I'm sorry about that. But could I? Well, I don't think that's actually quite fair. But can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question about Switzerland is about to have a referendum, isn't it? On do you get to vote in this? Are you now Switzerland?
Yes, I voted
this week on the question of whether the multiple of salary for top executives and others, and what do you expect to happen?
Well, in 1984 it was 7-1, the difference between the CEO pay and an average pay in a company. Now it's 43-1. Okay. And that's very, very damaging, because
so the Swiss rule would be to limit it to
12-1.
12-1.
And what do you expect will happen in the referendum?
Unfortunately, I think it won't pass. But the other one did pass. The one previously, it's all about timing. The previous one was that no golden hellos and no golden goodbyes. Okay, no golden gags either. Where CEOs, I think head of Novartis got something like 75 million when he left his job not to take on another job. Mm-hmm. Okay. But he had to give that up. He had to give that up. Well, only out of embarrassment. Okay, it's naming and shaming.
Are we out of time completely, or have we got time for one more question?
There was one more question there. Sorry.
Let's have a question at the back.
Darren Hall, Director of Big Green Week, and I was part of the team that helped Bristol win the European Green Capital competition. So I wanted briefly to ask about the economics of climate change, and especially in light of the comment from our leader about all that green crap, perhaps. When do you think the economics of climate change are going to start to impact on our ability to supposedly continue with growth?
So, I'm sorry, you're not going to like this answer. Internationally, I see no hope for this agenda. And the reason is, if you look at trade, in theory with trade, countries come together and share out the spoils of growth. What climate change negotiations require is that the world's nations, and it has to be a global solution really, share out the disbenefits of acting now for some future benefit in the future that's unspecified and that you can't work out, and whatever horrors are conjured are difficult to prove or to sustainably point to directly. Countries don't think on these time horizons normally. The idea that does the West want to rein in its living standards so that the Ganges Delta doesn't flood? And I just can't see anything in the way that the international world works and financial diplomacy works. I was there at a meeting in St Andrews of finance ministers where Alistair Darling tried this argument out on the Chinese and got absolutely nowhere. And so I'm pretty negative about how this works globally. Having said that, there are just some easy wins. And there are some easy wins domestically in a country like Britain with things like the housing stock. And you have to kind of plough on with this stuff. And I have to be careful because I'm obviously a working journalist, but the idea that out of the political process, we've known for 10, 15 years that making the housing stock more efficient is a win-win-win-win-win, right? People get lower bills and you get lower climate emissions, and you might create some jobs in creating more efficiency in the housing stock, and you might create nicer houses where kids can roam without, cold drafts. I mean, it's just blazingly obvious, but our political system is incapable of delivering the decisions needed to have this. And at the end result of all of these arguments, and we've known this for 10 years, I fear what's going to happen is that is what's going to get zapped over the next few weeks. That the efficiency agenda. I think politicians weren't very honest that actually there's a cost to pay, there's a price to pay. And if there's one chapter you might get to read, the response of the Indian negotiator to the climate change talks that failed, who was releasing a tiger that had, because of climate change apparently, had wandered into a village and he had to release it. The Indian negotiator who said, we will connect 500 million people to electricity and we will use our coal. And Ed Miliband, who was the British negotiator, Ed Miliband, who has 20 times my carbon footprint, is a hypocrite and he's not going to tell me what to do, was very telling and very direct. So yeah, now in an international, I think it's more realistic to presume nothing's going to happen. So you've got to look to domestic solutions, and I'm fearful over that.
On that cheerful note, I think we've run out of time. So we've obviously done wonders to lift your spirits today, but I hope it's been very interesting, and hand back to
Thanks, Daniel.
So, thank you. Before thanking our speakers, just a couple of announcements. If you'd like to get copies of Faisal's book, Daniel's books, The Economist in 2014, our good friends at Arnold Feeney are running the Economist bookshop at the back. And please do join them there, where I'll be taking them. And if you've got any other questions, I'm sure they'll be willing to answer them. There's going to be a break for coffee now for the conference delegates, and the coffee's over there. And I've been asked to say if you can reconvene at 2:30 for the next session, then you're going straight into your workshops. Our other guests, of course, are free to chat to the authors at the back, as usual. There's more events in the Festival of Economics. You look on the website, and it's also being webcast live by Wavecast. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your support for the festival. And most of all, join with me in thanking Faisal Islam, Daniel Franklin. Thank you very much.
Yes, sure.